Recording stopped. Honorable members of the Portfolio Committee on International Relations and Cooperation, our staff from the Portfolio Committee, I take this opportunity to welcome you to our meeting of today to deal with matters that relate to some of the ongoing conflicts and situations in the African continent, particularly in the Sahel region. Today, we are going to be joined by Dr. Gounden, who is going to be doing today's presentation. We also welcome those who will be joining us to follow the proceedings of the Portfolio Committee from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, South Africans who are using various platforms which have been availed by the South African Parliament as part of strengthening, deepening democracy and making it participatory. So I want to welcome you. Today's agenda is as indicated: opening and welcome, apologies, adoption, presentation by Dr. Gounden, closing remarks, and closure. Lobabalo, do we have any apology?
Good morning, Chair. We have 3 apologies, Chair. One from the Minister, he's attending Cabinet, and the other one is from Deputy Minister Moraga. She's in Zimbabwe attending the SADC summit, and then we have the third one from Honorable Mishra. He's attending another meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lubabalo. I see we have Clayson Munyela from DERCO, so you are welcome, Clayson, and those who may be joining you to follow the proceedings of today. As you know, honorable members, basically, in terms of South Africa's constitution, we have 3 responsibilities as Parliament. One is to ensure that we hold the executive accountable. That is done through the portfolio committees of Parliament, but we also have the responsibility to develop laws. We can amend laws. That's one of the responsibilities of Parliament. And the third one is public participation. So we have a responsibility through our programs as the portfolio committees to hold the executive accountable, but we also have the responsibility to make sure that as members of Parliament, through our various committees, we understand content and contexts within which we are pursuing our responsibilities, particularly where we are as the International Relations and Cooperation Portfolio Committee of the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa. So without wasting time, as you know, from time to time we invite various experts, institutions, including institutions of higher learning, to come and share views with us as Parliament on developments around the world, geopolitics in the African continent, so that we can enrich our knowledge, but also we can exchange ideas on how some of the issues and the challenges that we face can be attended to. As you know, when we have discussed matters as the Portfolio Committee and having taken whatever resolution or decision, that will be processed through Parliament. So to deepen our understanding on some of the developments in the African continent, we thought it would be important to invite Dr. Gounden to come and share with us issues that relate to conflict in the Sahel region. As you know, there are various regional mechanisms that have been put in place to try and deal with those issues. He will reflect on those particular issues and the roles that have been played from time to time by the African Union. So Dr. Gounden, once more, you are welcome, my brother, to the Portfolio Committee. You now have time of about 30 minutes or so to make your presentation, after which we will allow members of the portfolio committee either to make their own inputs or to ask questions and engage you on the presentation. Over to you, Doctor. Doc? Lubabalo, are you able to check
Recording in progress.
What may be the issue?
Okay, noted, Chair. I'll check now, Chair.
Hi, Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Dr. Gounden.
Sorry about that. I just had some problems getting into, but I'm here, as you can see. It is me.
We thought your gadgets have been reconfigured.
These things happen these days.
Yeah, they happen. Yeah, they happen.
If you haven't seen a movie called Zero Day, you should try to see it. It's an interesting movie with Robert De Niro, but it's very contemporary and it deals with all of these issues related to hacking and how they can create huge dystopian disruptions.
Yeah, if Elon Musk has challenges, then I agree with you. We will watch the movie. otherwise, over to you, Doc.
Sure, I'm just getting the presentation up. If you give me 1 minute, I should
No
be
problem.
there.
No problem.
We're having some internet problems. I think it's there. I think I need share screen. I don't know who's the technical person on your side.
Okay, Dr. Gounden, it's Lubabalo. Luba, are you attending to it? To share to give the rights of sharing.
Didn't come.
Chairperson, I've opened the rights to share, Chair.
Okay, I think now we have it.
Yeah, no, we are okay now, Vasu.
Okay, wonderful. So, Chair, I was asked to focus on the Sahel region and its implications for South Africa and for our continent. So I will switch my camera off now. Let me see. Where am I there? Yeah. Okay. So let me start by just taking you again through what I had presented the last time, just to give you again, as members, a context for what we're dealing with. I'm not going to go through the entire thing since I took you all through this the last time. But this diagram gives you our analysis of where we see the continent today. And as I indicated the last time, bearing in mind that we are 54 countries that are geographically, politically, economically, culturally very diverse and very different. But all of our countries on the continent display the same deep structural problems, and a large part of what we are dealing with in the Sahelian region relates to the fact that these deep structural problems are very, very prevalent in the countries of the Sahel. As I had indicated, there is no exceptionalism in this. And in even South Africa, our own country, has these deep structural deficiencies that if, as I indicated the last time, my own prediction is that if we do not correct these structural deficiencies over the next decade to 2 decades, many countries will slip into a dystopian future. Many of the Sahel countries are already there. They're at that tipping point. And you will see from the presentation why I come to that conclusion. But just to quickly give you a sense again of this diagram and what the implications are. So you will remember I mentioned that the center circle represents the elite. That is the business elite, the political elite, and the civil society elite. And that conceivably all of us on this Zoom conversation are in the center. What puts us in the center is that we have skills and we have access to capital, and that gives us mobility in society. So today you're a parliamentarian, tomorrow you could be a business person, the next day you could be an academic. You have skills that you can trade, and you have access to capital that gives you mobility in society. The second circle is where the major challenges come, and those challenges relate largely to urbanization that has been taking place over decades. So the one is new births of people who are on a daily basis. We are seeing a number of people being born, but there's also semigration of people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. And this is expanding that second circle literally on a daily basis. And then you have the marginalized periphery, which is in the third circle. Now, there are two factors, as I indicated the last time, that are complicating this particular issue, and that is exponential population growth and rapid urbanization. The key issue around all of this is that we do not have a population problem, despite the fact that we have a very, very high growth rate. To give you an indication, Lagos, which has 20 million people today, has a birth rate of 6%, which is extremely high, which is the reason why by 2080, going to 2100, Lagos, just Lagos, will have 100 million people. That's the number that we're talking about. So we don't have a population problem or an urbanization. We have a development problem. And what is that development problem? It's the trajectory of development that many of the other continents, Europe, Asia, Latin America, have followed, where urbanization coincided with industrialization, meaning the beneficiation of their resources or the beneficiation of our resources that they extracted from our continent, and industrialize their own countries by taking those natural resources and then using them to manufacture goods. But the value chain, of course, if they've extracted those resources from our continent, the value chain is lost immediately. Those resources leave the continent and find themselves on the shores of other continents. That's where the value is added, and that's where the employment is created. So all those continents had levels of industrialization at different points in their history. And unfortunately for us as a continent, we have become an extractive continent, and therefore we have not been beneficiating none of our natural resources, either our mineral resources or our agricultural resources. And therefore, that second circle is now characteristic of millions of people arriving to the second circle on a daily basis, but arriving to nothing. No employment, no education, no healthcare, sanitation, water, etc. And that is deeply prevalent in the Sahel region, It is, of course, also prevalent in other countries and prevalent here in our own country. But of course, the complications and the complexity is different from country to country. And in the Sahel region, it is extremely prevalent. So the second circle is the rapidly urbanizing circle. The third circle is where people are engaged largely in subsistence agriculture. There again, we have 60% of arable land in the world, and we are only utilizing 10% of that 60% of our land, and we are net importers. We should never have had a problem when the Ukraine war broke out and we had a shortage of grain in Africa. We should never have that problem. We have 60% of the world's arable land. We should have been producing and exporting to other parts of the world. So if there was a shortage coming out of the Ukraine war, we should have been filling that shortage in other parts of the world, not importing grain or finding ourselves with a shortage of grain, threatening food security for the millions of people in the continent, including those that are refugees and internally displaced people who in many cases are on the verge of starvation. So this is the deep structural challenge that we face on the continent. And I gave you the figures the last time, which shows how this issue is becoming increasingly more and more complex. Largely, again, as I said, not that we have a population problem or an urbanization problem, but because our development has not kept pace with our population growth and our urbanization, this now presents us with huge complexity. And those numbers that I gave you the last time, 600 million was the population of the continent in 1990. It was, today, we added 800 million more people, taking us to 1.4 billion. And by 2050, another 25 years, we will add another 1 billion people, taking us to 2.4 billion people. The second circle is today, on average, 40% across the continent. By 2050, we will be 70% urbanized. That's the 100 million we're talking about in the city of Lagos. That's now, you can imagine Lagos today and think about Lagos with 100 million people. That is, if the development of Lagos does not keep pace with that population growth, Lagos will be plunged into a dystopian future. For those of you who have been recently to Lagos, you will know what the traffic grid looks like, a gridlock rather, looks like in Lagos City, and you will know that crime, kidnappings, all of these things are highly prevalent, which means that organized criminal syndicates coexisting with the political establishment and a whole range of other actors, both negative actors as well as those trying to positively move the place forward, means that Lagos City could become one of those dystopian centers within a decade from now. Okay, so that's the extent of the challenge that we are facing on the continent. I'm going to pause at this point, Chair, and I'm going to switch my screen to where I can see everybody to see if there is anybody that has a burning question before I move on from there.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasu. Honorable members, at this point, Honorable Douglas, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Mr. Chair. I propose we go through the Sahel presentation because this one we did interrogate this previously and ask questions to it. So I would propose that we just go ahead with the actual presentation on Sahel and then move forward from there.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like that was the only hand we can proceed, Vasu.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so here's the Sahel region. as you can see, we are talking about a region with a number of countries stretching all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. So we are talking about 10 countries, as you can see there. It begins on the Atlantic coast of Senegal, Mauritania, and passes east through the central parts, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Eritrea, and all the way down to the coast. Now, that is the entire Sahel region that we're talking about. Just to give you a sense, you see Chad there. This is last year in Chad, where, as you can see, I think I look pretty good, Chair, in my blue outfit with a hat there, sitting on the carpet and having a meal in the desert with the minister in charge of the APRM and his colleague ministers. And there you see us walking and inspecting some of the attempts at farming. And there you see my colleague in the bottom photo, Senzo Ngubane, our head of research, and myself in one of the cattle farms also. So largely pastoralists, and to an extent also there are some agriculturalists, but you can see the situation there is not very good in Chad. And I have to say that, reading about it is one thing, but actually being present on the ground and witnessing, life in Chad, you get a very, very good sense of how devastating the situation is, particularly when we talk about Lake Chad, which was the lifeblood of this country. And that lake has been drying up over the last several hundred years, and is threatening livelihoods of many, many people in a country that needs to have livelihoods on an ongoing basis. Okay, so those are the countries that they pass through. I want to quickly just focus a little bit on the Tuareg people, because this chair is largely today, following the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, the Tuareg have become an important part of the challenges that we face in this region. They're indigenous Berber nomadic groups in the Sahara and the Sahel region. As you can see, historically, they controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, sold gold slaves. So they were very active. And, this is the tragedy. It's not that there was not an economy functioning in the region. And it is not that they were not, economically active. As you can see, they speak the Tamashek language. They use their own script. And they are known as the Blue Men of the Desert. I have to say that it's in a sense sometimes a little bit the derogatory term, but in South Africa, where we have been so race obsessed for a long time, you find even in Sudan, they don't talk about black, but they talk about blue-black. Because they are exposed to such harsh conditions in the heat in the desert. They have a long history of resistance against colonial and national governments, and there have been frequent rebellions due to marginalization, desertification, and economic struggles. Now, Gaddafi's role in the Tuareg conflict. Gaddafi recruited thousands of Tuareg fighters into his army. He provided them with weapons, training, and financial support, and promised to help them achieve political autonomy in that region. Now, with the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, it left all the Tuareg fighters stranded. jobless, and armed. And that was a recipe for disaster in that entire region. And what happened with the outbreak of that conflict in Libya, it triggered a mass migration of Tuareg fighters back to Mali and Niger. And that is largely what you are witnessing now, an ongoing conflict in that region, exacerbating an already terrible situation in the area. The National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad launched an insurgency around this time. They captured northern Mali and declared an independent Tuareg state known as Azawad. Islamist groups, and you see the three there, Akim, Ansar ad-Din, and Mujao, hijacked that rebellion, and Sharia law was imposed by those groups, and the Tuareg was sidelined, and this led to a whole lot of chaos in that area and concern across the African region. Now, when we look at foreign intervention and ongoing instability, France launched Operation Sahel in 2013 that, to an extent, pushed out the jihadists in the beginning, but that did not contain the situation completely. The MNLA briefly allied themselves with France, but tensions with Mali persisted. Now, Chair, the complication here, you will see that there are continuous shifting alliances in that region, which makes it extremely difficult to resolve the situation in that area. But we had a peace agreement called the Algiers Accord in 2015, but it failed to, again, as I said, fully resolve the conflict. The Tuareg remain divided, some seeking peace, others aligning with the extremists. Again, these are alliances of convenience that shift on an ongoing basis. Mali, Niger, and Libya continue to face Tuareg-related insurgencies in their northern areas. Now, Libya, as we all know, continues to be unstable. And, here again, we must say that when the Libyan conflict had broken out, the African Union had indicated that we needed a negotiated solution in Libya that took into account the influence that Gaddafi wielded. You all know Ambassador Welila Nhlapo. Ambassador Nhlapo was part of that delegation that was waiting in Nouakchott in Mauritania to fly into Tripoli to have negotiations with Muammar Gaddafi to see how this matter could have been resolved in a peaceful way, ensuring that there could be continuity and stability, taking into account the complexity of the problem from the east to the west of Libya. But we know that what they call then the Allied forces of France and the UK and the US, in their own wisdom, decided that they should implement the resolution that was passed in the United Nations calling for the protection of civilians, with that clause that said by any means necessary. And they then used that to engage in an aerial bombing campaign that then put the place in total chaos. In retrospect, even they agree, and President Obama, writing in the Atlantic after his presidency, indicated that that was one of his major foreign policy failures, Libya. And I think in retrospect, if we had, as the African Union and South Africa contributing our own resources for negotiating that settlement, if we were allowed to prevail, we would have got a better situation both in Libya and in the Sahel region. It was Hillary Clinton who famously said that if Libya collapses, it will be Somalia times 10. Well, it is Somalia times 10 now, and she should have heeded her own caution at the time. But be that as it may, now that Gaddafi fell, and he's the one who kept all the Tuareg together, but at the same time, he did arm them and train them. And so now what we have is in Mali and Niger, struggling to integrate the Tuareg fighters into their national forces. And this is very difficult because the Tuareg see themselves also as an independent entity. And this issue of Tuareg autonomy remains unsolved, which is what is leading to ongoing violence. And of course, the jihadist groups, they tend to exploit all of this instability. So the Sahel remains a security crisis zone with international military presence. As we know that France has left, but there are other players also in the region. Now we'll look at the formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, which was established in September 2023 by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The reason, it was a response to ECOWAS sanctions and failed Western security efforts and rising jihadist threats. And that was the reason that the Alliance of Sahelian States was formed. As you know, it emanated from the three nations that experienced their coups between 2020 and 2023, and ECOWAS in response, following, of course, AU protocols, did impose sanctions, both economic and political, on the three countries. And the three countries decided that they will form the Alliance of Sahelian States. Of course, as you all know, they expelled the French and have now built growing ties with Russia. I have to say that if we look at Burkina Faso, for example, even though there is a junta in place led by President Traore, they are not doing too badly in terms of dealing with the current challenges that they face. Now, the key objectives of the Alliance of Sahelian States, it's a mutual defense pact. If one country is attacked, the others will support. They have joint military operations to fight jihadist groups, and they have taken a conscious effort to reduce the dependency on Western forces. The security consequences of this is that ECOWAS loses control over regional security efforts. There is increased militarization, stronger army coordination. But of course, the risks are that we will see prolonged military rule. You will remember, Chair, in my last presentation, when I looked at the situation across Africa, I did indicate, because of those deep structural challenges that we face, and largely because we have now literally millions and millions of young people who are unemployed, who are sitting in that second circle, and they are highly vulnerable to being recruited by any force that promises them a better life, whether that is armed insurgencies, whether that is military groups that stage a coup, or whether that is organized criminal syndicates or populist politicians. These young people are highly vulnerable to being recruited. And as we had seen in Niger, when the junta met in the stadium, it was all the young people, literally hundreds of thousands of them, who flocked to the stadium. So one of the risks here is that we may see prolonged military rule. And I did indicate the last time when I did the presentation, one of the consequences of the fact that our development agenda has not kept up with our population growth and rapid urbanization, creating this very negative cocktail, making young people vulnerable, that we could see many countries slide into autocratic rule, prolonged autocratic rule, given the instability that they find themselves in. Now, from a geopolitical perspective, there's been a potential shift towards Russia and other non-Western security partners in that region. What are the consequences for ECOWAS and the African Union? It has weakened the authority of ECOWAS, which struggles to enforce democratic transitions in that region. There is, of course, economic strain, trade disruptions, and potential isolation of the AES countries. And, of course, the risk of fragmentation. Other nations may consider leaving ECOWAS. Chair, ECOWAS was one of the more organized security, regional security arrangements on the continent. And we know that ECOWAS has been successful in managing to stabilize that region by fielding peacekeeping forces under the hegemonic control of Nigeria. But that is all now threatened by the formation of the AES, and there have been many, many interventions to try to resolve that. What is its impact on the African Union? It undermines the AU's peace and stability efforts. It creates a divide between pro-democracy and military-led states, and it reduces the AU's influence in mediating regional conflicts. This is a very, very serious impact on our continental body, and it is something that we are seeing on a daily basis, the erosion of the authority of the African Union, not only by developments like the AES on the continent, but also by the proliferation of foreign governments, both erstwhile colonial powers, Cold War powers, but now new emerging middle powers who are all engaged on the continent for one reason or the other, largely pursuing their own interests. And this includes the Gulf countries, Turkey, and many other countries that are engaged on our continent. What's the future outlook and the key takeaways? The AES challenges Western and ECOWAS influence in West Africa. The security cooperation may strengthen anti-terror efforts, but long-term success is uncertain today because it is a very volatile region. And as we know from the last presentation I did, also that the insurgencies are on the rise. They're not decreasing. They are on a downward movement to the coastal West African states, threatening stability in those states as well. So it's uncertain whether in the long term we will manage to deal with this particular risk that we find ourselves with. There's further risk of regional instability if tensions with ECOWAS and the AU escalate. The economic and diplomatic isolation of the AES states could impact their growth also, and it could worsen the situation in those countries. And the future of the alliance depends on the military leaders' ability to govern effectively and maintain security. Personally, I don't think that we will see a shift from military rule in those countries anytime soon. So we should brace ourselves for a much more prolonged military governance in that area. Now, that's just looking at the AES. What is the nature of the conflict in the entire Sahel region? As you can see, the Sahel region has faced escalating violence and instability in recent years, primarily driven by terrorism. As I indicated earlier, armed groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, known as Achim, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and local militias operate within the region, targeting both civilians and military personnel. Then the political instability, as we have seen with the coups in many countries, then the continuing ethnic tension, fueled by ethnic and sectarian divisions, particularly between nomadic and sedentary communities in that area. And then, of course, as we know from the United Nations report, Africa will be worse affected by climate change. And largely, it's that region, the impact of desertification, drought, and resource scarcity will exacerbate the struggles for land and water, fueling further tensions between communities and governments. Key drivers of the conflict: political instability, as we've said, with the countries that have now all experienced coups, terrorism and extremism, as we have seen with the rising extremist groups in that area, ethnic tensions that continue to be prevalent in that area, and climate change. Of course, the humanitarian impact: displacement. Over 2 million people have been displaced within the region due to violence and insecurity, fleeing to urban areas or neighboring countries. Refugee camps in countries like Mauritania, Niger, and Burkina Faso are overcrowded and lack basic services. That's putting more pressure on those countries. And largely, it's the poor countries that face the brunt of the displaced people. When we were in Chad, Chair, we saw the impact of the 1 million Sudanese who have crossed over into Chad, a country that itself is already very, very poor, and now having to deal with 1 million refugees. And then you've got South Sudan. So largely in Sudan, if we just focus there, as one of the countries cutting through that area, in Sudan, largely those in the center circle, the one that I put up initially, the elite, who were the educated as well as the moneyed people, they were able largely to escape to the Gulf countries and to Egypt and restart their lives. It was the poor in Darfur and in other parts of Sudan who moved either to Chad, putting pressure on Chad, which already has serious problems, or going southwards to South Sudan. And as we know, the situation in South Sudan is deteriorating even today, putting pressure on the resources in South Sudan. So the displacement is creating huge challenges, not only for the countries from which people are displaced, but their neighboring countries also. Deaths and casualties: the death toll is staggering, with thousands of civilians killed in attacks by both terrorist groups and local militias. According to the UN, over 4,000 people were killed in the Sahel in 2020 alone. Food insecurity: the violence and displacement have crippled local agriculture, leading to widespread food shortages. Humanitarian organizations report that 18 million people in the Sahel are at risk of hunger, exacerbated by the conflict and climate change. Infrastructure damage: schools, hospitals, roads, and markets have all been targeted by extremist groups, making it difficult for communities to recover or develop. In Mali, for instance, attacks on UN peacekeepers and civilian infrastructure have delayed aid and reconstruction efforts. As you know, the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali has already pulled out of Mali. So we know that that is now also leaving a vacuum in that area. the African Union. The Peace and Security Council is responsible for promoting peace and security on the African continent. It has issued resolutions urging peace talks, sanctions against groups destabilizing the Sahel, and support for peacekeeping missions. For example, MINUSMA, the mission in Mali, which is operated to stabilize Mali and protect civilians, but now that mission has had to leave Mali. The African Standby Force, which is the other mechanism that the African Union has relied on, but for those of us who have worked with the African Standby Force in the Peace Support Operations Division of the African Union, we know that it is beset with a number of challenges and has not been effectively deployed anywhere on the continent to mitigate or resolve any of the situations that we're facing. The other is the G5 Sahel. It was formed in 2014. The G5 Sahel is a coalition of 5 Sahelian countries, Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. And it was created to combat terrorism, organized crime, and to enhance security and development in the region. However, in 2022, Mali pulled out. On the 3rd of December 2023, Niger and Burkina Faso pulled out. And then on the 6th of December 2023, the 2 remaining members, Chad and Mauritania, decided to dissolve the alliance on the basis that the other members are not going to be present. What are the key consequences of this, Chair? And they're very serious for the region, because these countries have managed to combat some of the insurgencies and have managed to stabilize there. So the key consequences is, firstly, there's a security void in the region. There's a shift in geopolitical alliances in the region, and there's economic fragmentation in the West African region as a result of this. The security implications of this, Chair, firstly, is we are going to see increased extremist activity. Around 3,000 civilian deaths were recorded in the first half of 2024, a 25% increase from the previous 6 months. We have seen the rising influence of groups like Akim and Boko Haram in that area. Now, the formation of the AES somehow managed to compensate this with a joint military force of 5,000 troops that have been planned, and they are focusing on regional self-defense without external interference, which in a way is a good thing also. What are the geopolitical and economic impact of this? Well, there's a realignment of alliances, a shift away from France and Western influence, and a growing partnership with Russia and private military groups. The economic fragmentation, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have, as I said earlier, withdrawn from ECOWAS, and increased barriers to regional trade and development are now prevalent in that area. The future outlook, Chair, the challenges are, firstly, we do not know what the effectiveness of the alliance of Sahelian countries will be, and there is the possibility of further instability if that regional cooperation fails. The opportunity, of course, for us on the continent is that there is now a potential for self-reliant security models. And we can now have partnerships across the world beyond just the traditional Western alliances. As you know, Chair, Accord, we also launched a Pan-African security company called EBAN, E-B-A-N, which is an Adinkra word from the Ghanaian Adinkra community, meaning to protect the family. It is chaired by former President General Obasanjo, and has a number of generals from our continent who participated in peacekeeping missions on the board. And the objective of IBAN is to ensure that we don't mortgage our sovereignty and security to external forces, and that we use African resources to see whether we can't capacitate our intelligence, police, and military special forces to deal with counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and to counter organized criminal syndicates. So IBAN is up and running. It is certified with the authorities here in the countries, the NCACC, and we will now be offering those services across the continent also, which is also part of South Africa's contribution. If we look at the other regional mechanisms, ECOWAS, as I said earlier, ECOWAS has serious challenges. I'm not going to go into that. And as you can see, MINUSMA also had to withdraw from the continent. Now, what are the challenges to effectiveness? Previously, coordination between different forces such as G5 Sahel, ECOWAS, and international actors were very, very poor. That led to an increase in the insurgencies. There were a number of overlapping mandates and inefficiencies in the counterterrorism operations. So to an extent, I think it is understandable why we have now moved to looking at how we build our own capability on the continent. Of course, there's always been inadequate funding, and even now, if we decide that we want some self-reliance on the continent, there will be continuous inadequate funding, but at least we should be able to use even our human resources, ex-special forces and other trained special forces on the continent to assist with dealing with these challenges. Of course, the issue of sovereignty versus intervention, some Sahelian governments, such as Mali, and later the military junta, have expressed resistance to foreign intervention, citing sovereignty concerns. This tension undermines regional and international efforts to restore peace. But because we have seen these challenges that we have had with foreign intervention, not only there to ensure security, but at the same time also preying on the resources of the continent. And that has undermined our development also. If we had true partnerships where we have seen our security concerns taken into account, but also our development concerns addressed, that would have been a different case. But if our security concerns were taken, were addressed merely to create stability, to extract our resources and beneficiate them elsewhere, this has not been helpful. And that's why we have seen a counter to all of that. The conflict in the Sahel is multidimensional, involving not only jihadist terrorism, but also ethnic violence, organized crime, and state failure. This complexity makes it difficult, Chair, for regional mechanisms to address the root causes and achieve long-term peace. Now, let's look at our own role. South Africa has used its diplomatic influence to support the AU's peace efforts in the Sahel. It has called for more inclusive peace processes and has been instrumental in facilitating dialogues between warring factions. We supported peace talks in Mali, and I mentioned earlier our efforts in Libya also. We have been supporting, we are one of the key contributors to the African Standby Force. In fact, a number of nationals from our own country were in charge of the Peace Support Operations Division. Latterly, Mr. Bam, who has just finished his tour of duty there. And we have also provided troops and logistical support. Although the ASF has struggled with capacity issues, our commitment for peacekeeping continues to remain very strong. As you know, we have been involved in Burundi, we have been involved in the DRC, etc. Technical and logistical support. We have provided technical and logistical expertise to the G5 Sahel, particularly in the areas of counterterrorism and military training. And I know when we were there, our ambassador introduced us to a South African company that has been there for 5 years, commissioned and paid for by the African Union to assist and train the G5 Sahel, particularly those that were stationed in Chad, to train them in command and control. Regional stability. By strengthening the G5 Sahel operational capacity, South Africa helped to promote greater regional cooperation and address cross-border issues such as human trafficking and arms smuggling. Of course, now we know the G5 Sahel doesn't exist anymore. We have to see how with the AES and with the other countries in the region, we might be able to continue to support South Africa in ways that can assist to enhance the capacity of those entities. Now, the challenges, of course, to our own role, we have limited military capacity. Our military is strong but not large enough to manage extensive peacekeeping efforts across a vast region like the Sahel. Chair, I had the opportunity on Friday to address our Defense Force senior management, the Chief of the Defense Force, and members of the Military Command Council, as well as members of the defense industry at a public-private partnership conference in the defense industry held at the CSIR. And I did indicate there that we, as a country, need to look very, very carefully at the current state of our military and to determine how we will respond not only to national security threats, because we will have increased national security threats, but also foreign threats to our national security that come from other countries, as well as instability on the continent that threatens our own economic activity on other parts of the continent. Deputy Minister Bantu Olumisa, speaking at the conference, indicated that there is a decision to move our defense spending from 0.7% of GDP to 1.5% of GDP to modernize our military and make it more fit for purpose in the current situation. In my presentation, I did indicate, Chair, that what we will face on the continent, apart from the domestic threats of increased internal instability in our own country, we are going to face across the continent a rise in social and political conflict, ranging from peaceful protest escalating very quickly, as I said last time, in about a week in Kenya and in Mozambique, to violent conflict, and all the way to full-scale urban warfare, as we see in Sudan. And, Chair, in addition to that, the rising insurgencies and rising criminal syndicates. And I indicated to the audience present on Friday that we don't need to be producing sophisticated missiles, because that will not be fit for purpose. South Africa, and I challenged the Chief of the Defense Force and the Minister to say we should become first in class in dealing with urban warfare, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. That's what we're going to be facing on the continent. I thought I should throw that in because it will land on your table as International Relations Committee at some point. I'm happy to expand on that if any of the members want to interrogate that particular aspect and why I might be advocating for why we need to modernize and adapt our military for future challenges. As you can see, there are domestic priorities and political considerations that we have. Economic challenges and social issues here in South Africa sometimes limit our capacity to prioritize external peacekeeping operations. We are presenting a budget today, so I think we're all very, very aware of the domestic pressures that we have on our fiscus. But at the same time, we have to ensure that we protect our internal stability, and we ensure that our businesses operating across the continent, bringing much needed revenue for the stability inside the country, are also protected outside. Of course, there are political considerations. As I said, South Africa has to balance its interests as a regional power with those of other African nations, many of which have divergent views on intervention and peace-building strategies. Progress and achievements, and I just have one or two more slides, Chair. Diplomatic successes. South Africa, as part of the AU, has helped broker peace talks and facilitated dialogue between opposing parties, such as in Mali, but in many places across the continent. There's been announced cooperation, working with different regional organizations, and we have been supporting national reconciliation using our own reconciliation as an example. What is the way forward for lasting peace in the Sahel? Several key actions need to be prioritized. There has to be greater coordination between the successors to the G5 Sahel and ECOWAS, and it is essential to address cross-border threats and improve peacekeeping operations. As I mentioned the last time, Chair, the insurgency moving southwards, threatening the coastal West African states. When we were in Sierra Leone and Liberia last year in September, meeting with the security hierarchy, including the chiefs of defense, intelligence, police, border control, and their deputies in both countries indicated that approximately 60% of their borders are unmanned, which means that these insurgencies, if there is a vacuum, they will move downwards and they will just walk across the border in those countries. Therefore, there is a need for increased funding for peacekeeping. Regional peace operations must be better funded by both African and international partners to ensure sustainability. But we do know that there is a move to defund the United Nations, and one of the first areas that will suffer will be peacekeeping and the underfunding which is already occurring of peacekeeping operations. We require comprehensive development strategies to address the root causes, and we have to work very hard, not only on the military side to counter violent non-state actors, but we also have to double up our efforts on dialogue as a preferred method for dealing with conflicts, both on the prevention side, mitigation, and resolution. So, Chair, the conflict in the Sahel is a complex and ongoing crisis, but mechanisms like the AU and successors to the G5 Sahel with support from South Africa have made progress in promoting peace. Continued diplomacy, regional collaboration, and enhanced resources are critical for a sustainable solution. Our own contribution we should remain a key player in the AU's peace efforts, but challenges like limited resources and domestic pressures will hinder our ability to fully address the crisis. And with stronger regional cooperation, international support, and a more inclusive approach to peace building, we hope in the next decade or so, the Sahel can ultimately achieve lasting peace. It's not beyond us, Chair. It's possible for us to do it. So let me end here and then open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasu, for that very, very comprehensive, enlightening, broad contextual presentation on the situation in the Sahel region and how at the same time is intertwined with geopolitical developments globally. Members, we can now engage with this presentation. We will start with the Honorable Nobile Mhlongo.
Good morning, Chairperson, colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair. Really, Chair, the situation or the conflict of Sahel, it's good that it's here and we're discussing it as a committee. So, firstly, Chair, I would just want to say, you know, for us to really understand the conflict there in Sahel, we must understand that African states are a result of neocolonialism. I think we must take it from that point first and foremost. And sadly, these are African states mainly, they still remain dependent on their former colonies or former countries that have colonized them before. Now, this then reminds me or sends me back 240 years ago when the Berlin Conference set and decided, which was actually a meeting of colonial powers that signed the General Act of Berlin, which was just an agreement of European colonies to subdivide Africa amongst themselves without involvement, consultation, or the consent of Africa. Now, the Berlin Conference said and petitioned Africa without really our consent and all. And sadly, the Sahel conflict is now a legacy of the malicious petitioning of Africa. West African countries, we know in the main, they were apportioned to France. And these are the legacies. They've been fighting to keep France troops away from their country, away from occupying their country. They've been fighting France troops and France as a state to stop interfering and meddling in the affairs of their countries. Now, if we remember correctly, Chair, in 1960, yeah, which was declared the Year of Africa, all colonies of France, in West Africa, in the West Africa, they all gained independence. And I say independence in inverted commas or quotation marks. So I know that at this point, sitting here today, we agree that independence was not really independent as it was portrayed at that time to be independent. Now, Chair, if we look, these countries gained their independence circumspectly with the understanding that these countries were never really free from their colonial rulers. Now, colonialism in Sahel region morphed itself into neo-colonialism, which is the last and the worst state of imperialism, as we all know. Now, let's agree and be honest that since the Declaration of Independence in 1960 in the region, that region has never witnessed freedom. They have never witnessed peace. That independence came at a price where it is not possible for them with the continuous interference of France in that region. They've never really witnessed freedom and peace since that 1960 year. Hence, we saw the assassination of people like our brother leader Thomas Sankara in 1987, who, like the current president Traoré, ascended to presidency through a coup. So the military takeover in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger must really be celebrated as another attempt by brave revolutionaries who want to attain true independence and complete decolonization. They are seeking for independence and they are seeking for sovereignty of their country and to decolonize their country and to claim their independence from France, if you are just being honest. Now, we know that the Sahel conflict really refers to the protracted battles in the West African region. The conflict is mainly, like Dr. has explained to us, as is characterized by terrorism and bloodthirsty rebels with no census by the West and mainstream media, is what the West and mainstream media has characterized it. Now, we must, where I sit, or we must really uphold the resolve and bravery of these countries and their revolutionaries to stand up and say, no, not in our country. We are not going to continue to be allowed to be colonized in this manner. So, in essence, the juntas you are referring to, Chair, they understand that freedom is not free. freedom is not something which is given out of the magnanimity of the oppressor. They understand that very well, that freedom cannot be negotiated. It requires a sense of revolution in order for you to really gain true a freedom. Now, we must look at the withdrawal of these countries from ECOWAS, ISWAPO, and NMTFA as a means to eject France and the UN, and which I think is a correct move. It is a move which seeks to affirm their independence and sovereignty. In all honesty, these unions, unfortunately, they are very compromised instruments of neocolonialism. Now, as the EFF, I'm going to be honest, we salute the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for their decisive move to seek self-determination in signing the Alliance of Sahel States Confederation Treaty. Now, the formation of the AES is a powerful testament, Chair, to the commitment of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to its sovereignty. It's a commitment and a clear message that they are sending to the imperialists that these nations will no longer agree to be controlled, and they are forging a new political alliance that seeks to prioritize development and autonomy of their people. Now, as Africa, Chair, we must really begin to sort out our own problems. African problems require African solutions and require African states, not the intervention of any other person who's outside of Africa. Now, the establishment of African Criminal Court or the Malabo Protocol, I thought the speaker was going to speak about the Malabo Protocol and the African Court of Justice and Human Rights, is a very, very progressive move, which should be supported by all. And we must really advocate that the ICJ and the ICC should not have jurisdiction in matters that involve only African states. If a matter is between African states, we shouldn't have a situation where we seek intervention from the ICC or the ICJ. It shouldn't work like that. It should be that we then implement the Malabo Protocol. We then ask the African Criminal Court to intervene, and then AU should play a pivotal role in ensuring that the Malabo Protocol gets to be implemented. Like I think previously in this committee, we have explained that AU should have a bigger legislative role to play. Instead of just having a role of consultation, we should elevate the African Union Commission to have some legislative powers over the African states and African affairs, so that it is able to interfere correctly at the right time, or to intervene, to send intervention. I think I'm looking, intervention in African matters. And then we must demand that we must self-regulate as Africa and deal with laws that seek to oppress the people of Africa in general. Now, I want us to go back memory lane here in the southern part of Africa. You will remember, Chair, that in 1959, the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, which was led by Joshua Nkomo, next door here in former Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, ironically was dealt with in 1959. In 1960, you will remember that even here in South Africa, leaders of the former liberation movement, in which you belong to, Chair, were declared terrorists by the West. So it's not a new phenomenon that we've got African leaders who then are declared terrorists by those who seek or by our former colonizers. It's okay to be declared terrorists as long as we are fighting for the sovereignty, independence, and self-determination of our countries. So it's not a new phenomenon. You will remember what was happening in the southern region of Africa in the years 1959, 1960, during that year in which it was declared a year of independence in West of Africa. So there was then a declaration by the West that Africa, the southern part of Africa, were going to declare leaders there because they were in support and fighting the apartheid regimes of their country, fighting those who were colonizing us in the southern part of Africa. Then they decided to declare our leaders, former liberation movement, as terrorist organizations, and the leaders of the former liberation movement as terrorists and persona non grata. So it shouldn't worry us when we've got African leaders really who are declared terrorists. But when you look at the actions that they are taking, it's actions that seek to fight for the true liberation, decolonization, and fight for the sovereignty and self-determination of their country. It cannot be that even to this day, Chair, we still see our former colonizers doing whatever it takes to interfere in the businesses of our countries, or interfering in the business of Africa. And we know why they do that, if we're being honest. The only thing that we'll find our former colonizers fighting to destabilize Africa is because they seek or they then benefit from the conflict and the wars of Africa. They then use it to exploit our mineral and natural resources out of Africa. They're not only doing it in Sahel, they're doing it all over in DRC, with the assistance of Rwanda through Paul Kagame. They're doing it everywhere, Chair. It's a trend, it's a phenomenon. Perhaps that Berlin conference, 140 years ago, Chair, gave these colonizers an impression and an entitlement to our Africa. They feel like Africa belongs to them. Is a subcontinent, is a satellite continent of the West and of Europe. Whereas we're not, we are a continent on our own, we are independent states. They then use the Berlin Conference to subdivide Africa in order for them to share the wealth of Africa and appropriate it to themselves at the exclusion and the betterment of the African child. So, we're not shocked that the leader of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger really are labeled as terrorists. And because they are labeled terrorists by people who colonized them, it shouldn't worry us. It shouldn't make us to now not want to support them in their fight for self-determination and sovereignty of their country. Instead, we should have the AU going there to ensure and assist and sending our military there. We should be having a African military where we unite all the militaries of the African states to have a powerful military force that at any time will stand ready, will stand guard to go anywhere where there's conflict in Africa, to ensure that we then safeguard the interests of our people, the interests of our natural and mineral resources that seek to be exploited by Europe and the West whenever they cause instability. So we must support, look, this thing is not only about Niger, Burkina Faso, it's about the whole Sahel region. If you can look South Sudan, what is happening in South Sudan? They've never had peace in South Sudan, Eritrea and Chad, and all the other countries in the Sahel region. It is because of the persistent interference of the country of France. It's persistently interfering there with one purpose in mind: greed to exploit our natural and mineral resources. That's the only reason they're interfering there. They don't believe that African states can self-determine, and we must fight through the AU and through PAP Chair to ensure that our African states are protected, their sovereignty is protected, and our self-determination war is protected, and the rights of people. Now, when you look in these countries, Chair, these countries that mainly are of Muslim belief, that they've now, if you check, the West has really bastardized jihadism in these countries and portrayed these leaders as terrorists, in something which should not really upset us or frustrate us. If we have African leaders declared terrorists by the West and Europe, it shouldn't bother us, because it's how they view African leaders, because they want to micromanage us in their own life. So in closing, Chair, Africa must unite or we perish. we either move as a unity, as a unitary form, or we are going to really punish. So it's up to Africa to decide what is it that we want to unite, or failure to unite, then what awaits us is really to perish. Now, you know, in the words of former president of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, he said that Africa must travel together as one, or no part of it will arrive at its destination. I think that should drive all of us, that Africa needs to travel this journey together as one, or else we will all not arrive at our destination, because they will continue to exploit the neighboring countries in order to cause instabilities in our country. The continuous conflict in Sahel is going to create a problem for the whole African continent. So we must be able to travel this journey with our brothers and sisters in the Sahel region, and move with them as one, and offer them the necessary support, the necessary skill, in order to continue to challenge the remnants of colonial exploitation, and then build an integrated Africa whose vast mineral wealth serves as economic freedom for the African child. We must, in fact, Chair, in future, we must also be able to analyze the role of Russia through the Wagner Group in the African continent. I think that's something very interesting that should also, be a topic for discussion here in this platform, that we then analyze it, what is the role of Russia or the Wagner Group in the African continent, and how do we then build forces or friends with progressive international forces outside of Africa? How do we build a formidable force with countries like Vietnam, with countries like Cuba, with Russia, with Latin America? How do we build a formidable force with the global south, with the BRICS countries? How do we consolidate ourselves in order to bring stability, peace, security in Africa, in order to build an economy of Africa that seeks to bring economic freedom for the African child, and to bring to allow to have Africans owning our economies, owning the means of production, being in charge of all the mineral wealth in our country, being in charge of our economies. So we must look at all those topics. I was just suggesting it, that at some point we must consider it, the issue of Russia through the Wagner Group in the African continent. How then do we tackle it? How do we move and work together, or how do we see it? How do we view the Wagner Group in the African continent? How do we then go beyond it? But really, Chair, we must denounce and really tell France to walk away from Sahel, and really leave the Sahelan region to the African countries there in Sahel to self-determine and to get sovereignty, so that they're able to really gain true independence. But we must really encourage these leaders in the countries who have walked away from ECOWAS and from this alliance in the Sahel region to fight off the French troops that have really interfered in their country for so long. Thank you, Chair.
Honorable Bisongo, thanks very much, Chair. Thanks very much for that input. We welcome the Deputy Minister, Elvin Bortes, the Honorable Elvin Bortes. You are welcome, Deputy Minister. The next speaker is Honorable Douglas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable Chair and members, thank you, Mr. Gounden and Accord, for a very good presentation. Africa stands at a crossroads. The crisis in the Sahel is not just a crisis of security, it is a crisis of identity, of African sovereignty, and the future of our continent. What we are witnessing in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and beyond is not simply the result of insurgency or terrorism or climate change or what the West is saying about it. It is the unfinished business of decolonization and the fight for the freedoms of the people of Africa by the people of Africa. For too long, Africa has been treated as a battleground for external powers to take our resources and build their economies. But we now need to change that. First, they enslaved us, then they colonized us, and now they militarize us. They tell us that without them, we cannot govern ourselves, that without their peacekeepers, we cannot have peace, or we cannot keep peace, that without their loans, we cannot develop like the IMF or the World Bank. But we in the MK party reject this manufactured dependence by the West or anybody else. The Sahel crisis should be a wake-up call for the African Union, ECOWAS, and all regional bodies. Why must we still rely on France, the United States, and other actors to decide Africa's security and resource future? Why, 60 years after so-called independence, are African states still being sanctioned for taking control of their own destiny? When will Africa finally belong to Africans, Mr. Chair? And this is what MK is fighting for in South Africa, but this is also what needs to happen and is happening currently in Sahel. And as South Africa, we need to go and support them in every way we can, from an economic, diplomatic, and a resource point of view. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, is not just a military pact. It is a declaration of independence from external control. Whether we agree with their governments or not, we must recognize that the Sahel nations are saying what many African people feel inside our hearts. We are tired of waiting for solutions that never come. We are tired of our leaders answering to foreign capital and to the West instead of their own people. The African Union must decide, will we be the architects of Africa's future, or will we remain the gatekeepers of an old colonial order? The time has come for an African-led security doctrine, an African-controlled economy, and an African-centered future. We in the MK believe that African sovereignty is non-negotiable. Let us not sit here and debate Africa's problems while waiting for Western diplomats to tell us what is possible according to them. Let us act now for the Sahel, for South Africa, and for the liberation of all African people. Let's unite and stand together to fight against the real enemy of our people. I urge this committee to stand for the sovereignty of African nations, to reject the continued economic and military control of our continent, of our resources, and to demand that Africa's future be written by Africans for Africans. Now, in relation to the presentation, Mr. Chair, we're given the Tuaregs people's long-standing grievances of marginalization and the historical control of trans-Saharan trade. What efforts has the AU made to ensure the inclusion in national governance structures of Mali, Niger, and Libya to prevent continued insurgencies? The MK party believes that the African Union should prioritize indigenous people's self-determination and push for inclusive governance models rather than leaving these matters to former colonial borders that continue to fuel instability. The failure to integrate the Tuareg is part of a larger problem of Africa's colonial borders and of Africa's indigenous and aboriginal people. The fall of Gaddafi also, which is mentioned by Professor Gounden, the fall of Gaddafi led to armed Tuareg fighters being displaced, contributing to insecurity in Sahel. How has South Africa, through its role in the UA, contributed to stabilizing the post-Gaddafi situation and addressing the arms proliferation crisis? The MK party has long argued that South Africa should take a stronger stance against foreign-led regime changes that leave power vacuums. Like what happened in Libya, we must reject the continued destabilization of Africa through externally engineered conflicts. When we look at France and their interventions, Mr. Chair, this is a long relationship France has had with Africa, and a long colonial relationship. Not a positive one for us as Africa, a negative one. France launched Operation Sahel in 2013 and has since continued military operations in the Sahel. What are they doing there? They have no business being there. This is not their continent. How has the continued French presence benefited or harmed South Africa's long-term security strategy? And how should the AU advocate for full withdrawal of former colonial powers? What is those Western powers doing on our continent? They don't belong here. We will handle our own conflicts ourselves, because most of the conflicts are started, supported, funded by them. The MK party supports the removal of Western military forces from Africa and advocates for African-led solutions to African problems. The continued presence of foreign troops signals a failure in African unity and security. And when it comes to the AES alliance of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, this signals a major shift in the regional power dynamics, Mr. Chair. And we support what they're busy doing. And And we support that there must be change. The MK Party believes African unity must be preserved, but we must recognize the AES as a response to ECOWAS's failure. The AU must ensure ECOWAS does not become a tool for Western political influence over African states. They choose alternative security partnerships. So, Mr. Chair, there's a lot of things happening with organizations like the Wagner Group coming in and supporting governments against Western aggression. With the expulsion of French troops and the increasing reliance on the Russian security partnerships, including Wagner forces, what is South Africa's position on balancing diplomatic relations while ensuring African security independence? Because the MK Party does not support blind allegiance to any global power. We are non-aligned. Be it Western or Eastern, Africa should negotiate on its own terms and ensure that security partnerships do not lead to neo-colonial dependence. So, Mr. Chair, from our point of view, this conflict is very, very powerful in changing the African narrative. We need to see how we're going to help the over 2 million people who have been displaced due to violence in the Sahel. I took note of what Professor Gounden has said, that many of the countries above us have said that their borders are more than 60% porous, that these non-state actors who are militarily equipped can come from where they are all the way down to South Africa at some point. Firstly, our military is not equipped. It's not that they can't handle it. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the personnel. We're not giving them the funding. And today's the budget. I want to see if there's funding for our troops in DRC. I want to see if there's funding for our troops in the field, for these so-called peace keeping efforts. We need to make sure that we have the African standby force, and that should replace foreign troops in Africa and should be fully funded by African states. So Africa must push for the African standby force to be a priority at AU security summits. So, Mr. Chair, the MK Party stands very firm in its belief that Africa must break free from dependency on Western security structures and foreign aid-driven solutions. We need African-led security strategies, self-sufficient economic models, where we take our raw materials, we process them, we beneficiate them, put them through smelters, put them through manufacturing, get the maximum benefit for our people, create the jobs, take them out of poverty, build new cities, and get that resources to build a future for our people, to take them out of the shacks and to create a better future for them. So, Mr. Chair, we can do it, but we have to stand together and we have to stand behind people that are taking these bold steps towards African unity, self-determination, and the full operationalization of African-led security mechanisms to ensure that our continent is no longer at the mercy of neo-colonial interventions. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Douglas. We now have Honorable Powell. Over to you, Honorable Powell.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to Dr. Gounden for the presentation. Chair, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. I'd like to first deal with some of the opening remarks made by Dr. Gounden in regards to the legacy of colonialism and the role of former colonial powers in regards to the extractive relationship, the allegedly extractive relationship in the contemporary circumstances fueling conflict. I think that there's broad consensus in this committee about the abhorrent nature of colonialism and the scramble for Africa and the very real consequences that African nations continue to navigate as a result of artificial borders having been drawn up. But many of the remarks that have been made by previous speakers are not necessarily factual in the context of what the trade numbers and the trade figures tell us in terms of the relationship that African countries have with Western powers in the contemporary context vis-a-vis developing economies like China. And just to put that into context in the South African context, we see that whilst our largest trading partner is indeed China, the exports that South Africa sends to China are indeed raw materials and mineral resources. They're derivative exports. The primary export, of course, being ores, slag, and ash, followed by iron and steel, followed by copper. And then there's various other items that one can access online on a variety of trade monitoring platforms. So we see that this is indeed an extractive relationship in the contemporary circumstance, that we as South Africa and many other African countries are indeed sending off raw extractive minerals and materials to China that are then used to produce value-added manufactured goods that are then sold back to South Africa and other African countries as value-added goods. So we end up with a deficit. If we compare that, for example, to our exports to the United States, we see that over $1.2 billion US worth of our trade, the second line item on the trade stats, is in fact value-added manufactured goods in the form of vehicles, railways, and tramways. So these are commodities that are manufactured in South Africa that have associated supply chains, and then the value-added manufactured good is exported for sale in the United States. So in the contemporary context, it's empirically incorrect to state that there continues to be an extractive relationship between certainly South Africa and Western powers. The inverse is in fact true. We're exporting value-added manufactured goods now to Western democracies, and we have got an extractive relationship with the likes of China. If we look at the European Union as a bloc, as a region, if we talk about Western powers, and we've heard a lot about France, we see that in terms of manufactured goods, actual value-added manufactured goods, in terms of the SITC product groups, 42% of all South Africa's exports to European countries are manufactured goods. That's significant and completely inverse in regards to the raw materials and the extractive minerals that China is buying from our country. Which brings me to the context of this in regards to the Sahel. So I'm quoting a paper that was produced by the Air Command and Staff College by an academic by the name of Laura Rojesef recently in regards to the Sahel region, and specific China's involvement in that region. And I quote from this paper in regards to the role of mineral resources from the African continent being used to develop external economies. I quote, "Lithium proves even more strategic to China. The country dominates the global supply chain for ore and intends on maintaining a quasi-monopolistic position. The rise in lithium prices caused by increased demand for electric vehicles will likely spur competition." Geoffrey Cliff, a British journalist, articulates that the geopolitical effects of the lithium race are already being felt. It is a reason for China's growing presence in Africa, including its funding for infrastructure projects, obviously such as the Belt and Road Initiative, that support the extraction of mineral resources. In this context, top Chinese company Ganfeng Lithium invested $130 million in the Malian Goulemania project. Geologists believe the site to be one of the largest lithium reserves in the world. If estimates prove correct, China's incentives in the Sahel region could drastically increase in coming years, steering the need for a more enduring military presence. From the Chinese perspective, participating in Sahel peacekeeping and counter-terrorism operations serves several purposes: securing Chinese investment and nationals, strengthening its political influence, and contributing to the People's Liberation Army's modernization efforts by providing combat expertise. Now, this is all in the context of securing access channels and lanes to commodities, raw materials, minerals that will then be used in China to develop their economy and sold back to poor African economies as manufactured goods. So I just think that when we talk about neo-colonialism, we should be very clear about what it is that we're talking about, and that we should be informed not by our ideological ideas, but rather by the contemporary facts that are substantiated by evidence-based empirical data that is easily accessible and that is tracked by impartial institutions across the world. Then moving on, Dr. Gounden, you spoke about Blue Men of the Desert and the long history of resistance against colonial and national governments. And then you went on to speak about Gaddafi and Islamic jihadists exploiting regional instability in marginal and the role of Islamic terror groups. What we did not, in my view, in my respectful view, we very much appreciate your learned opinion and views, and we appreciate and acknowledge your vast expertise in this area. But I do think that what was missing from your presentation was an analysis of the significant role that Russia is playing in deliberately destabilizing the region in order to expand its influence in Africa. So I have pulled a report that I was given at the Munich Security Conference in early February, and it's a report that's been put together by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the report. This meeting is indeed Z-listed until 1 o'clock, so I'm glad that we've got some time. I won't take too long, but I do think there's some important points that need to be made. So I'm quoting from the executive summary of a report that's titled Mercenaries and Illicit Markets, Russia's Africa Core and the Business of Conflict. And it states, for more than a decade, Russia and its intelligence services have strategically deployed criminal networks to carry out a range of activities, such as smuggling, assassinations, sanctions busting, spying, and cybercrime. Implicated in murders, massacres, rapes, and other atrocities in some African countries. These mercenaries have been accused of terrorizing civilian African populations, carrying out industrial-scale smuggling of gold, diamonds, and timber, notably in the Central African Republic, and spearheading political disinformation campaigns and election rigging. A number of countries across the world have adopted resolutions designating the Wagner Group an international terrorist organization. After Prigozhin, you would all recall him as the previous head of the Wagner Group. After Prigozhin's death, many international observers speculated that Russia's dangerous disruption in Africa would wind down. Despite setbacks, however, Russia's mercenary, military, and criminal engagement in Africa have continued apace throughout 2024 and early in 2025 through Wagner and later the Afrika Korps. The Afrika Korps, the state-backed successor to Wagner, managed by Russian military intelligence, now has a presence in Burkina Faso and Niger. At the same time, Wagner maintains its legacy operations in Mali and the CAR. Russian military instructions have arrived in Equatorial Guinea, although it's unclear if these so-called instructors are affiliated with either organization. Russia has positioned itself as an alternative security partner in the Sahel in the service of autocratic and military regimes. This has capitalized on disenchantment with former colonial powers and Western assistance in African security, which has been unsuccessful in containing major insurgencies. The Afrika Korps has pursued similar strategies to Wagner. These include the aims and target countries Afrika Korps has pursued, its use of political influence campaign, and its personnel and tactics. Many of its recruits are Wagner veterans. It has targeted many of the same countries courted by Prigozhin in Africa and uses similar approaches of sending expeditionary forces to kickstart new operations in Niger, Burkina Faso, and the region. Political influence operations and disinformation campaigns were part of Wagner's Africa operations, and similar strategies are carried out by the Afrika Korps, including through an organization known as the African Initiative. Ostensibly an African-focused media house, the African Initiative has shared disinformation and promoted Africa Corp's role in Africa. It appears that Russia may be expanding its presence in the natural resources sector in countries where the Africa Corps operated, echoing how Wagner's role allowed Prigozhin's networks to operate, spanning both illicit and licit activities. It appears that Prigozhin's son, Pavel Prigozhin, has maintained some role in the residual Wagner operations in Africa. It has continued its illicit business operations in the Central African Republic, including its involvement in smuggling extractives. At the same time, it has taken casualties in Mali, where illicit economies are fueling jihadist and rebel competition and violence. Before Wagner, private military companies were not a significant part of the Russian military apparatus. During the invasion of Ukraine, new private military companies emerged to provide additional support. After the Wagner mutiny, these PMCs were brought under the oversight of the Volunteer Corps and are now managed by the Russian Defense Ministry. Russia's growing profile in the Sahel has made it the target of rhetoric from armed groups that have increasingly positioned themselves as hostile to Russia as an intervening force. Ironically, like Wagner in the Central African Republic, these groups are also financed by the illicit trade in gold. There is growing local anger towards the Russian forces among Sahelian communities. The report goes on to state that some factors have remained the same. While Africa Corps is more explicitly state-backed than the Wagner Group was in the Prigozhin era, it is still primarily made up of Wagner veterans who are pursuing the same goals. Africa Corps and Wagner remain the most influential and strategic tools for Russia in Africa. They will continue to exacerbate the deteriorating security trends in the Sahel and continue to spread dis and misinformation, fueling instability. As seen with the case of the African Initiative, Russia's military engagement in Africa continues to be accompanied by political influence operations that seek to spread disinformation, specifically about Western former colonial powers, and target any level of Western engagement in Africa. So a number of recommendations are then made in terms of how international academics, specialists, and intelligence operations have been tracking what's going on in the Sahel region, and the interventions of a number of foreign countries in terms of exploiting the crisis in order to serve their own economic dependencies and supply chain needs, especially as they continue to wage war in their respective regions. We know, for example, that Russia's under immense economic pressure because of all of the sanctions that it's confronting for having illegally invaded the sovereign state of Ukraine in 2022. And so, of course, the raw extractive mineral resources and sheer human resource potential of the African continent as a developing continent plagued by instability and insecurity would serve as very useful tools in assisting the Russian state, certainly in augmenting its failing state capacity. So the recommendations that certainly the Democratic Alliance would support, and Lubabalo, I would like to ask that you, as the committee secretary who is responsible for taking minutes, listen very carefully to these recommendations so that these recommendations can be pulled through into the committee report that is tabled for adoption in terms of how we as Parliament, South Africa's Parliament, recommend that this crisis be managed. So firstly, we recommend as the DA in this committee, investing further in countering Russian disinformation in Africa and increasing messaging that highlights the Africa Corps and Wagner's indiscriminate violence and the inability of governments in Sahel to contain these security threats. We recommend enacting more rapid and coordinated sanctions efforts against Russian mercenary actors. While sanctions designations must follow rigorous due process, we do encourage that South Africa develop a rapid and coordinated response to process sanctions of governments that are involved in such egregious actions. We recommend engaging via the East African Community and the African Union, the governments of Sahelian states, in order to engage them on the very real risk that hosting Russian paramilitary presence or Russian adjacent military presence poses to their future stability. We recommend prioritizing assistance towards countering illicit economies to engage states and buttress stability. We recommend addressing the security challenges posed by private military and security contractors from across the world, whose operations threaten human rights, self-determination, and stability on the African continent, and that this committee work to assist DIRCO in developing coordinated strategies to manage these risks on the African continent, and that all of us as parliamentarians and DIRCO taking a leading role explore efficient ways to counter disinformation and find ways to mitigate the political impact of deliberate dis and misinformation campaigns, as we see in the Sahel region, a lot of it attributed directly to the Russian government. And then, of course, just to continue pointing out that whilst partnership with China is crucial for our continued development, that partnership must indeed be equitable, and that we encourage a more balanced trade relationship with China, that we're not sending over extractive raw minerals and resources and then importing value-added manufactured goods. And we again, as the DA, reiterate calls for African governments to be sovereign, and for African countries to find African solutions to African problems, and that any military and political leaders that are involved in grave violations of human rights or hostile coup d'etats be referred by our government to the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is a court that, of course, exists, but has been underutilized. I think that that's a good start in terms of countering any allegations that Africa is subject to some kind of unilateral contemporary Western hegemony, because the facts just quite simply, from an empirical perspective, don't bear these allegations out. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Powell. Thanks for that input. Our next speaker is Honorable Bottas.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and let me in particular appreciate the presentation by Advocate Vaso from Accord, because this is really a very important, this is the role that South African non-state actors should play in advancing South Africa's national interests. A positive role that look at obviously the AU 2063 agenda, how to have inclusive, prosperous South Africa, obviously anchored by pursuing the AU's flagship program on silencing of the guns. So the conduct of Accord, Honorable Chairperson, should expressly be noted as really a non-state actor, other than organizations such as AfriForum and Solidarity, that constitute the antithesis of both our domestic and foreign policy aspirations. So I thought I must probably enter with that. Just from my side, Chair, because I know the unique capabilities of Accord is really in peace diplomacy. Now we know, for example, the African Union's peace and security architecture, its main pillar is obviously the PSC, supported by an array of structures, including the Panel of the Wise and the Peace Fund. Obviously, the African Standby Force, Early Warning Continental System is there, etc. But for me, it's important that Advocate Vaso, take us into confidence on the difficulties within the Sahel. How do we see the role, and if there is concomitant engagements with the Panel of the Wise as it relates to engaging, in particular, the Alliance for Sahel States, given the fact that there is an imperative to have a transitional pathway towards democracy, because deepening democracy and governance, it's a very important aspiration pillar of the AU Agenda program. Is there engagements with the Panel of the Wise, with the AU Commission, obviously, and others, as it relates to what could constitute their role? And maybe if he can obviously also, speak to us on the Peace Fund, themselves as a court, are they supported doing this, what I call Pan-African work, on peace diplomacy? Are they supported also through the peace type of a fund, and probably look at what is his recommendations in relation to that? I think the other point, the third point, Chair, he made an important, he made this prognosis that the dilemma that we have witnessed because of the rise of the military rule in the 3 states will obviously create a reality of a distant acceptability of military government to be part of that region for the immediate future, as you have indicated. Now, I agree that probably given the fact that ECOWAS has obviously been, not been able to establish a particular pedigree of proximity to the Sahel states, but the PSC protocol also provides for partnership between the AU on the one hand, the UN and other international stakeholders on the other hand. Just from his experience being, active on the ground, what is the leverage, obviously, from the UN that may be pursued as it relates to this matter is concerned? And then the fourth issue from my side, and this is, it could be probably unfair to ask him this, but I think it's, if he's able to, in his repository of knowledge, respond to it, I'll appreciate it. If not, I think it's something that we should continue to try to clarify ourselves. Look, the one key issue is the question on political economy. So that is the one key issue. Even if you look at the military, the mineral complex of, in particular, those 3 states, I think members of parliament would also appreciate there is a consequent type of interest. Now, there has been some pronouncements made by the leaders in different platforms as it relates to the CFA, the West African franc, the CFA, and given the fact that in as early as in the late 1940s it was introduced, they are obviously pivoting on a particular pathway. But be it as it may, as we speak, Chair, they obviously still remain part of the West African Economic and Monetary Union. What is his thinking? What is likely to happen as it relates to those states would they ultimately, seek to have a particular currency and abandon the West African franc, given the fact that the West African Economic and Monetary Union, it's obviously a key and critical issue when you speak about political economy. Maybe just his type of sense. And I think, look, lastly, Chair, I think I would obviously fail in my being here, although I'm here obviously to accrue, knowledge from a very important non-state actor, which I think it strengthened our repository of knowledge. But I would fail if we don't at all times, even as the portfolio committee of Parliament, constituting really the what I call the ordinarily supposed to be the most those that possess the most unique expertise within foreign policy, not to understand that South Africa subscribe in terms of our foreign policy. We subscribe to sanctions only authorized by the United Nations through the UN Security Council. And we do not, Chair, in terms of foreign policy, subscribe to unilateral country-to-country limitations, restrictions, or sanctions. That constitute a contrast in relation to how the UN, on the occasion of its 80th anniversary, operates, and it's against the deepening of multilateralism. It would be a great error of judgment in relation to our pursuit of in advancing a multipolar world, especially in this geopolitical dispensation. So those are my contributions, Kiutumet Sarah.
Thank you very much, Honorable Buertes. Honorable Muela.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to you and greetings to the Deputy Minister and all honorable members and everyone in the platform. Let me equally take this opportunity to welcome the high-level presentation by Dr. Gounden on the conflict in the Sahel region and its effectiveness of regional mechanisms and South Africa's support of the AU process towards a lasting peace in those particular regions of Sahel. So I think the first thing, Chair, I think our approach and our belief as a South African state is to ensure that there is peace and stability through our SADC missions and other effective approaches that we are using to make sure that we stabilize those regions of Sahel and ensure that and African states maintain their own identity without any influence from any former liberational view or any Western imperialist agenda that will fuel and divide the African state even further. So, Chair, I think I've got an input to make with regard to the presentation, which was very thorough and very much in depth. And also there are some recommendations which were made, I think, which are very progressive. And I think I will propose, Chair, that to the meeting that we package all the recommendations which were made here, and then we recommend that they be adopted in the next meeting as we will be preparing for initial submission to Parliament, so that we are able to take these recommendations, which are very much progressive, as part of the portfolio committee view with regard to the direction which we're given. So I'm proposing that we package these recommendations, Chair, and so that we adopt them in the next meeting and subsequently send them to Parliament for ratification. Thank you very much, Chair. That will be my submission.
Thank you very much, Honorable Muela. Thanks very much. Okay, it doesn't look like we've got other hands from members here on the platform. Dr. Vasu, just before I hand over to you, I don't know what will be your view on some analysts who believe that the areas like in the Sahel, the way in which currently developments are actually an attempt that some people may see them or analyze them as a necessary approach adopted by some of those areas, which other people may say is coups, but that actually it does help them to ameliorate some of the inherent challenges that emerge from Western democratic value systems, because we all know that there are other studies that actually indicate that democracies can be vulnerable, particularly the Western way of democracies, where capital can be used through other agencies like NGOs and so on, where there's circumvention of the same democracies which are being practiced. So I don't know what will be your view on that particular matter, because there are researchers who have also brought it to the forth that some of the destabilizations in the African continent are actually a consequence of some other states with interests within the African continent using and actually abusing the democratic processes space within the African continent to advance their own narrow economic interests, which then bring instability in the continent, such as in the Sahel region. So I don't know what will be your view to a view that says that actually, if the people themselves in those areas are not rising against and overwhelmingly opposed to a way of thwarting some of these vulnerabilities of Western democratic system, that that actually that could be something sustainable in the eyes of the people in those areas. So I will want your own view on that particular matter. The second point actually relates to what I think, honorable members, we may have to deal with ourselves here in Parliament, because part of the problem in the African continent, when you look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, for instance, accountability mechanisms are not very strong, which have to be done through mechanisms such as Parliament. I'll make an example. Well, some members have raised, correctly so, the challenge about industrialization in the African continent, the exportation of raw minerals and other products from the continent. But there are some initiatives which have been put in place by the African continent itself. For instance, there is a industrial development plan, which has been its genesis come from NEPAD. But the problem here is that we, as parliamentarians throughout the African continent, we don't on a regular basis say, in terms of accountability, what progress are we making towards making sure that there is indeed industrialization in the African continent? Is there a set aside of resources, for instance, budget-wise, to make sure that this comprehensive industrial development plan in the African continent is indeed implemented? And I will just refer members here to a specific part of what comes from the African Industrial Development Plan. And it says that the acceleration of Africa's industrialization requires the adoption and implementation of the specific measures and actions at the national, regional, continental, and international level. National governments, in collaboration with the private sector and civil society, will have to take the lead in member states for the initiation and implementation of the activities. Regional economic communities should serve as the main agents for the promotion of industrialization at the regional level, whilst the African Union and its strategic program, NEPAD, should, with the support of UNECA and the ADB, play a similar role at the continental level. Africa's industrial development will also require actions at the international level that will involve international organizations, including the UNIDO, the World Bank, WTO, as well as Africa's development partners, in specific actions and measures required for the promotion of Africa's industrial development plan. So, in as far as I'm concerned, I think we are going to have to, on a regular basis, working with you, Honorable Botes, the executive side, make sure that Parliament from time to time, also from members who serve in the AU, from here in Parliament, the parliamentary arm of the AU, make sure that we follow up on these matters. And they will relate, for instance, to whether in line with this industrial development plan, there is an agreed comprehensive plan, for instance, on education, on skills development, so that you are able through your own skills to then do this beneficiation that we are talking about, which is necessary. So I think that's one of the things that, as honorable members, we should make sure that we hold the executive accountable on. The third point from me, Dr. Vasu, is whether the Africa is succeeding in trying to manage for its own benefit, for its own self-preservation and growth, whether it's able to manage dynamics that emerge as a result of member states within the African continent entering into bilateral mechanism with states outside the African continent. Because those bilaterals that are entered into, which are necessary, which are unavoidable as a result of globalization, they do, in my own view, if they are not properly looked at, they can become an inhibitor of the necessary unity you have to build within the African continent, because you must at the same time respect the fact that those states are sovereign and they've got their own rights to enter into bilateral agreements with other states within the global affairs. So I just want to check whether you think there are risks that are inherent from external, where these bilateral mechanisms can actually be abused or be used as an instrument to make the unity of Africa, particularly around uniting around the issues of the economy and making sure that the stability that forces from outside can make use of those bilateral mechanisms for their own interests. The fourth point is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement itself. When we look at it, honorable members, and you look at the European Union approach to them working together as an economy of the EU, there are a lot of similarities between the two. That's point number one. Now, I don't know from your point of view, Dr. Vasu, whether the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is actually doing complementarism in as far as the economy of Africa is concerned, or is more tilted towards managing competition among the African states themselves. Because when you go through it consistently, there's a regulation in as far as competition among the products that are produced within the African continent is concerned. The standards are adherent to standards, to regulations, and so on and so on. Whether we can say it's complementary or is tilted more towards competition, or is a little bit of both. It just depends on the extent to which member states can master the art of relating among themselves in as far as this Africa Free Continental Agreement is concerned. One point that one will want to make, honorable members, is that if we don't have political stability in the African continent, we must forget. We can talk all these things about the economy, about strengthening the military. You can be how strong militarily. The standby force of hamstrung as it is, for instance, if we are to get resources and so on, and have the the AU standby force, very strong, very powerful. It can intervene militarily because it will have been capacitated to do so. But if there's no, in my view, political stability among the political parties in specific member states within the African continent, we will not be able to achieve stability in the African continent. So our own stability as political parties in the African continent is for me is one of the important conditions for us to have a stable continent. The last point that I will want us to look at in future, outside what Dr. Vasu is going to say as the committee, is South Africa's economy. And I'll just make an example. When you look at exports from South Africa, for instance, let's take which country? Let's take the US. And let's take the motor industry, the automotive. If you take Toyota, Ford, General Motors, VW, you take Mercedes-Benz, you take BMW, and so on. These are foreign originated and foreign owned companies, but they are in South Africa. So they constitute part of the South African economy. So when you do aggregation in terms of national interests, and you look at South Africa's economy, of course, you will look at a percentage of the exports from South Africa. It will look good on paper. But there are two variables that we must look at when we look at these exports from South Africa, as I'm making examples with these companies. One, it is ownership of those companies. So in terms of South Africa's dynamics, the ownership of those companies will belong to a section which is white in South Africa, which benefited from apartheid and colonialism. So if you just present a percentage that says we export so much, for instance, to the US, and we don't go deeper and say, in these products that we export, for instance, to the US or whichever country, Black people who the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa say, when you look at the preamble, it says we have to deal with the injustices of the past. Now, injustices of the past were imposed on a certain race, and that race is Black. So when you look at these exports, they reflect those injustices of the past. But when you talk in terms of national interest, of course, it does look good because it appears like there are all these finer, refined, finished products that South Africa is exporting, for instance, to the US, when actually ownership patterns, when you look deeper, they still reflect the status quo, which is inherited from colonialism and apartheid, which actually says that the democratic state can be viewed basically as a mere mediator. It's just managing the dynamics of the economy and not literally managing the economy in a way that begins to tilt ownership patterns in terms of control of those companies to those which the Constitution says are members of society on members of South African society who were, as a consequence of apartheid and colonialism, then suffered injustice. So as a committee, I think in future, we are going to have to dissect the South African economy and say, what are the dynamics of this economy in terms of imports, in terms of exports, in terms of processing for finished products and so on who owns what. Because when you look at the South African economy, just in brief, it will show you that Black people provide labor. They are laborers in the South African economy. So going forward, the question will then be in the context of international relations, when we do investments, there are imports that come into the country, there are companies that come and invest into our country. How do we then use these dynamics to have a different picture for the future so that we can then achieve, in economic terms, this united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist, and a prosperous society, which will be vastly different from a South Africa which is now 30 years from 1994, and a South Africa from 1994 going backwards from 1652. Those are my views, Doctor. You will do a pick and choose and on the inputs that have been made by members, those that you want to clarify, but we have noted everything. And as the committee, I think there was a suggestion by one member that all the recommendations that have been made here, we are going to sit down as the committee, process them, we adopt the proceedings of the minutes of our meeting, and we will then, after agreeing on them, find a way of taking them through Parliament. We will, at some point, when this has been done, come back to you, Dr. Vasu, so that we can then not have you making a presentation, but have you as part of an audience and listening to the committee now saying, this is how we are taking forward the recommendations, which are a consequence of the input that you came to make here today, so that we don't just engage in an academic exercise and we tick the boxes and so on, but there has to be tangible results from the discussions that we have. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the members for all the very incisive questions. Chair, I want to do justice to all these questions, and I've noted them down, but I also want to be extremely comfortable when I do that. So now I will propose that I take a 3-minute comfort break and you allow the others to do the same, and then I will address the questions.
No problem, Doc. We will be back, honorable members, at 11:30.
In 3 minutes, yeah.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Doc.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And yes, I will be very happy to come and reflect with your committee once you have deliberated and you have formulated your recommendations. Let me start, Chair, because these are very important issues, and let me reflect on them now with you, because I think that they are crucial to how you will then formulate your own recommendations. The issues that your committee deals with, more than any other committee, probably defense and intelligence, but because you deal with a very complicated and complex set of circumstances that involve differing interests across the entire world, not just interests inside our country. And so it becomes very, very difficult to navigate. And I've been listening carefully to the points of view of the various members. I'm very happy to see that although Honorable Mhlongo comes from the EFF, Honorable Douglas from MK, Honorable Powell from the DA, although Honorable Moela didn't say much, but he is from the ANC, and yourself, Chair, you are from the ANC also. I can't say that the Deputy Minister is from the ANC because he's not in that capacity in this forum. He's here in his capacity as a member of the executive. And I think that's an important point to make. So let me say that despite everybody coming from the different parties, with understandably so, different points of view, all very valid, and I'll explain why I say all very valid, that at the same time, they all reflect some things in common. One, that we should be looking to the interest of our country and to the interest of our continent, that we must protect the sovereignty of the countries of our continent. We must not allow our countries to be exploited or our people to be abused. And I got that as a common thread coming through from all of those who contributed. Now, last week on Thursday, I was asked by the Finnish ambassador to address a forum that the Finnish government convened to honor several Finnish citizens, including the former president Martti Ahtisaari, for their contribution to liberation in Africa, and particularly his contribution in Namibia. And so I spoke at Freedom Park, and there was a question during question time from one of the delegates that were there, about 200 of them, about Pan-Africanism. And in reflecting on that question, I indicated, I started by saying there are three people sitting in the front row that have something in common. And that was Welila Nhlapo, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and Sats Cooper. And what the three of them have in common is that these three South Africans come from a generation that grew up in what we all know as the Black Consciousness Movement. And they were student leaders at the time in the Black Consciousness Movement. And I said what the Black Consciousness Movement talked about was the mindsets of people, that how do you change your attitude and how do you influence your mindset? And I said what we require in Africa today is akin to the Black Consciousness Movement. We need an African consciousness movement where we all begin to think as Africans and think of ourselves as Africans. and imbibe that ethos and orientate our mindset towards liberating our minds, firstly, from whatever colonial, as I think Honorable Douglas put it, and I wrote it down very well, from our enslavement, our colonization, and now our militarization. I thought, Honorable Douglas, you captured that very well. So it's a mindset thing, and whether it was Honorable Powell, and I found your input very valuable there also, or Honorable Douglas and Honorable Mshlongo and yourself, Chair, and of course, Deputy Minister. We're all talking about how do we liberate our minds to think about this continent of ours. So let me just depart from that point, that I think is something that we and your committee needs to build that ethos within your committee. You will differ because you come from different political persuasions. But front and center of your thinking has to be, one, our national interest. And our national interest supersedes any political ideology. And the continent's interest as Africa should also supersede political persuasion. So whether you say, I support the coup in Niger, because I think it gets rid of the French, but it also, in the same breath, it got rid of a president and his ally, former president, who were both part of the Socialist International. So a kind of contradiction in political terms about how we view that and how we see it. But these are the contradictions that we have to deal with. Now, let me also just add, Chair, that's why I put the pictures there initially, that I'm not talking to you as an academic from an academic textbook that I lecture at universities from. No, I don't lecture at universities. As many of you know, and as the Deputy Minister knows, every second week I'm in some country on the continent on the ground working with people. So the reflections here reflect that. So let me start with Honorable Mshlongo. I think you are right on the Malabar Protocol. Look, in any event, the international instruments that we signed up for, also the Rome Statute, etc., are now under threat because they have been discredited, and they've been discredited largely by the powers who were advancing them in the first place as a normative framework to deal with impunity at a global level, but it ended up dealing only with some countries and not with others. And so its credibility has been lost. And that's the first part. The second is even the major powers, the United States, for example, has been very open and vocal about it. It will not support the ICC. So I think they're talking about us as a continent relying on the Malabar Protocol is an important point at this juncture, particularly. But it also needs to be said in the same breath that only around 15 countries have signed up to the Malabar Protocol, and we need 28 countries to sign up before it can come into force. So again, an African consciousness, if we're talking about this, how is it possible that after so long, only 15 countries have acceded to it? So we need to put more effort into that to say, how do we actually do that? When you also talked about an African army, we have that. We have that in the African Standby Force. That is the reason for the African Standby Force with its regional brigades that are in the different parts of the continent. But for many reasons, financial reasons and other reasons, we have not been able to make them operational effectively. That African Standby Force for 14 years has had huge challenges and has not been effectively deployed anywhere. Now, if it's a funding issue, and you must remember that 85% of the budget of the Peace and Security Department of the African Union comes from Europe. So we must say, if we're talking about this, and fortunately, as South Africa, we are a regular paying member, but we must now ask the other African countries to account. With all their resources and all of what they have, why are they not contributing to making these instruments effective? Now, I come, Honorable Douglas, to what you have said, and I can't disagree with anything that you have said. Africa must negotiate on its own terms. This is a priority. But I will address the question of the CFA, which Deputy Minister raised, as well as what the chair raised about bilateral negotiations in the context of what you have raised now about Africa must negotiate on its own terms. So on the bilateral trade issue, Chair, about 3 years ago, the Singaporean ambassador visited Durban, and I had dinner with him. And during that dinner, he made a comment about the effectiveness of ASEAN, which they belong to, and SADC, which we belong to. And he said that there could be a wonderful symbiotic relationship between the two regions based on comparative advantage. At the time, SADC, around 300 million people, ASEAN, maybe slightly more, but we have certain comparative advantages, they have certain comparative advantages, and if we came together as SADC and ASEAN, we could be very, very prosperous. And I agreed with him. And I said, Ambassador, did you discuss this with the SADC Secretariat? And he said, absolutely, I discussed it with them. And what did they think? He said they thought it was a wonderful idea. So I said, how did you move it forward? He said, well, you know, what happened thereafter was that individual countries in the SADC region started to approach individual countries in ASEAN on a bilateral basis. And that is not a very strategic approach that we should be taking. So you are correct that bilaterally, it opens us up to being exploited, to becoming weaker in negotiations. South Africa, with our 60 million people, we are not a significant market. And none of the other SADC countries with their populations is any significant market. But SADC as a region, we are a significant market. Then we start to matter. And so we need to be thinking in these terms if we are going to move forward as a continent. Now, when it comes to the CFA, Deputy Minister, I'm very glad that you raised that, because it goes to the heart of the challenges that we face, particularly with the negative sentiment against France. France is not an innocent player. And I'll come just now, Honorable Powell, to Russia as a player also in that part of the world, and why we need to be vigilant to make sure that Russia does not become a negative player in the region also. But let's sit on France for a bit. Now, the CFA, this has been a very, very contentious issue in West and Central African countries, all of whom are formerly colonized by France. While to some extent it provides monetary stability, many people argue in the region, and all of us on the continent, that it negatively impacts these economies in several ways, and I'm just going to list out some of them. Firstly, there is limited monetary sovereignty. The CFA franc and the countries that use them have no control over their monetary policy, as it is pegged to the euro and managed by the French treasury. These are facts. This is not something I'm taking off the top of my head. This restricts their ability to devalue their currencies, to boost exports and control inflation during economic crisis. So that's the first big problem that we have. The second problem we have is capital flight and limited investment into that part of the world. The member countries are required to deposit 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in France's treasury, reducing the liquidity available for local development. This is very serious when it comes to stability in these countries. Now, this arrangement, of course, unsurprisingly, benefits French banks and businesses, but it restricts capital for local investment. You must remember that as South Africa, with our rand, having our own sovereign currency, we have huge amounts of domestic capital sitting inside our country. And we hope at some point we will be able to unlock that domestic capital. But you can imagine if we were now trading in the euro and 50% of our capital was sitting in Belgium or somewhere. This will be really an untenable situation. Thirdly, they become dependent on French economic policy. The CFA franc's value is tied to the euro, making exports from these countries more expensive and less competitive in global markets. So these economies remain reliant on France and Europe, reinforcing those neo-colonial economic structures. Fourthly, there is always a structural trade imbalance. The CFA franc economies mainly export raw materials, that's cocoa, oil, cotton, but they export expensive finished goods from Europe. So there's always that structural imbalance. This keeps them continuously in a cycle of dependency, preventing industrialization, which we talked about as key to our continent, and to maintaining them as self-sustained economies. Fifth, inflation and economic rigidity, something we're all battling with. While the fixed exchange rate keeps inflation low, it also limits economic flexibility. Countries cannot adjust their monetary policy to respond to shocks like commodity price fluctuations or external debt crisis, both of which plague countries in the CFA region, as they do with many other countries on the continent. The moment those commodity prices fluctuate, some of those economies just tank completely. Sixthly, they end up favoring French and foreign companies. France still maintains strong control over key industries and financial institutions in the CFA countries. And the currency's stability attracts foreign companies, but local entrepreneurs struggle due to high borrowing costs and a lack of domestic investment. Seventhly and lastly, the political influence and sovereignty issues. The CFA franc system allows France to retain political leverage over African economies. We've seen this. This is starting to wane now. And leaders who have attempted to reform or leave the CFA franc, like Thomas Sankara, that Honorable Mhlongo talked about earlier, faced economic pressure, political stability, and in his case, political assassination, not political, physical assassination. Now, countries in this region have attempted to reform this. In 2019, the West African countries announced plans to replace the CFA franc with the ECO, reducing French control, but implementation on that, as we know, has been slow, but it takes a long time. And I'll address that through just now with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement also. And the Central African CFA countries have made no significant moves because they're all now mired in instability. So we have to think about, while somehow it may be, some might argue that the CFA brings a level of stability, there is a trade-off with a lack of financial sovereignty. It prevents industrial growth and long-term economic autonomy. So these are the things, Chair, when we look at this, and Deputy Minister, you were correct to raise this issue because this is the problem. And this is why people have now so negatively turned against France in that region. Now, coming then to Honorable Emma Powell's issue on neocolonialism, you are 100% correct, Honorable Powell. We are concerned that we should not have erstwhile colonial powers like France now replaced by neocolonial powers. And the numbers you give is correct. And I see the chair attempted to address the structural difficulties when it comes to the numbers you gave on finished goods going to the US and raw materials going to China. That is a cause for concern. You are correct when you say we send raw materials to China and we send finished goods to the US. And the chair nuanced it by talking about ownership on that. So this is something we need to discuss and say we don't want to be exploited either by China or by Russia or by the US or by France. We want to have sovereignty of our continent, and we want to ensure that our resources are beneficiated for our own benefit on the continent. The value chain must remain on the continent. We cannot allow, whether it is lithium going out to China or whether it is Glencore or any of the other Canadian mining companies or Swiss mining companies, French companies who have been mining here for centuries, to take our natural resources without adding value to them. And of course, those countries like Vietnam and India and the Gulf countries who are now buying land in Africa and who are not beneficiating for our purposes on food security, but they are utilizing our land now to produce food for their countries. And we are saying, there must be a different way with all of those countries, whether it is the United States, which now is going to aggressively move into Africa also for our resources, or whether it is France and United Kingdom, Russia, China, Vietnam, India, all of these countries come and add value on the continent. Do not take our raw materials and leave the continent. So when it comes to private military companies, Honorable Powell, I said in the last presentation that we are very concerned about the influx of private military companies in Africa. Wagner being, of course, the most famous because of what happened with Prigozhin, and the Russian government now converting it into the African Corps, which is no different from the French Legion that has been there for centuries on the continent. The French Legion is a state-owned military company. Wagner is a state-owned military company. And we are seeing now a development on the continent that some governments are looking at setting up state-owned military companies, and they have deployed them already in some countries on the continent. But when it comes to PMCs, I said last time that apart from Wagner, apart from the French Legion, there is also Sadat out of Turkey, which is very active in the DRC currently, has been active in Somalia. And I was in Turkey last year, and I had some meetings with them to say, but look, we are not negative about your expertise, but we don't want you on the continent unless you are going to work in partnership with us for the benefit of our continent, to secure and stabilize our continent so that we can develop. And apart from Sadat, when I was in Ireland last year, meeting with the Irish government, their foreign ministry, it was their director general in their foreign ministry who indicated, or one of the colleagues there, that in their newspapers, and I picked it up in their newspapers later, that there were Irish mercenaries training in Libya. So you've got Irish mercenaries. You've got any number of French contractors, any number of UK contractors. I was last year at the Special Forces Club in Knightsbridge in London. I met a number of them who are now on our continent. And we were 2 years ago in the United States. There are any number of American contractors paid through AFRICOM and paid through the Pentagon who are on our continent. Now, what we are saying is exactly what you are saying, Honorable Powell, and what Honorable Douglas and Honorable Mhlongo have said also. We need African sovereignty. And that means that our security must be in our hands and we must shape our own destiny, which is why I said earlier on that 3 years ago, we went to see President Obasanjo to say, President, we have a serious problem. We are mortgaging our security to private interests, private companies, and foreign governments. And this is going to be very dangerous for our continent. And he said, Vasu, you are correct. What do you propose? I said, I propose that we set up a Pan-African security entity to train and equip our national militaries to deal with the current challenges on the continent, which range from urban warfare to counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and dealing with organized criminal syndicates. And he said, fine, go ahead. And he now chairs that company, which includes a number of very prominent generals from across the continent who have experience in this, a number of national security advisors who are on the continent, who are now coming together, and we are using African expertise. General Gay from Senegal, when I sat down with him with this entity, he said, Vasu, we need this. I said, General, can you give us special forces trainers? And he said, if you need paratrooper trainers tomorrow, I would give you 6 paratrooper trainers. So the capacity is here on the continent. We just need the political will to put all of this together, and we're already making progress in that direction. Deputy Minister, you remember when you were in Durban, I briefed you on this matter. So, and I'm very happy to come and brief the parliamentary committee on this matter. I mentioned it at the conference on Friday, also at the CSIR, indicating that our defense industry, our government must come together to see how best we can position South Africa, build its capability so that it can play a constructive, meaningful role in the stability and security of our continent. Now, Deputy Minister, you also raised the issue. I hope, Honorable Powell, that I've addressed some of the issues. We are very worried about the PMCs, and in that basket, we are worried about Wagner also. And we want to make sure that they do not compromise our sovereign security and our sovereignty on the continent, that they do not engage in human rights abuses. You must remember, yesterday in a court here in Durban, we had a Ukrainian delegation. And I said to the Ukrainian delegation that was here that we are very concerned that when the war in Ukraine ends, that all those surplus weapons in Ukraine will find its way into Africa, largely through arms traders, a lot of them coming from those countries. And in addition, those soldiers who now have nothing to do in those places will move to Africa, and they will engage on the continent, and a lot of them engage as mercenaries, not in organized entities, but as free mercenaries on the continent. And they have already, we know that Wagner and the Ukrainian special forces were engaged in Mali. And they were also engaged in Sudan. I pointed this out to the delegation yesterday, that it is people from your country that were involved in Mali and in Sudan. And this is untenable. We do not want to see this in Africa. We want to make sure that we are rid of all of this, and we want to be able to take this into our own hands. So we want to make sure that this happens. Now, Deputy Minister, you raised about Agenda 2063 and what we have on the continent. Yes, the panel of the wise have been used in that region. A good colleague of ours, Professor Batili, who spent quite a bit of time in Libya, he went to meet with the generals from the three juntas. So there are ongoing efforts. President Obasanjo was also deployed to go and meet with them to see how we can ensure that however they set up the AES, and they're entitled to do it, that it doesn't divide the region or the continent, because that's not what we need on the continent currently. So yes, they are engaging with that. When it comes to the Peace Fund, we don't personally, as a court, we don't get money from the Peace Fund. I think the Peace Fund itself, it is being deployed in a number of areas on the continent, particularly in peacekeeping, and now what we have as peace enforcement. But it needs to be shored up, and we need to appeal to not just governments, but also the billionaires on the continent, people like Patrice Motsepe and Dangote and others who have their philanthropy foundations to contribute to African security, so we can reduce our dependence, for example, in the Peace and Security Department on external partners, and now have Africans funding African initiatives. If we talk about African solutions to African challenges, well, it must be with African money. We need to make sure that our governments and our private sector put their money where their mouth is and put their funds into these things. Now, the PSC protocol and coups on the continent. This is something we are discussing within the African Union. A number of us who have been working with colleagues in the African Union, in the REX, it's a worrying development, because remember that the AU has had a protocol that deals with unconstitutional changes of government. And because of our history of coups in Africa, this is something we are very, very wary of. And so there came this protocol on unconstitutional changes of government, and correspondingly also non-indifference, so that if we see huge atrocities committed in a country, we can't be indifferent about it. So this whole protocol on non-interference, but also non-indifference. And now this one on coups. And Chair, you also raised it. And so the big debate now is about popular coups. What happens if you have a repressive government in place that is repressing its people, committing huge human rights abuses, colluding with forces internal and external to the detriment of the people of the country? And somebody arrives and says, we can rescue you, and then overthrows that government. Something that when this protocol against unconstitutional changes of government was formulated, we did not contemplate. And so there's a lot of thinking around how to deal with popular coups on the continent, and largely those coups in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali can somehow be categorized as popular coups. There's no answer to that question just yet, but I can tell you for sure there's a lot of discussion around that, and how we should be dealing with what can be considered as popular coups. It's a very, very fine dividing line, particularly in an era where we know there will be democratic backsliding and a rapid move towards autocratic governments. And, you know, for those who might espouse autocracy as a way to stabilize countries, and there are some merits to that also. I myself have said from time to time that in some places, you know, you will need some kind of, but, you know, Aziz Pahad used to always remind me, Vasu, be careful what you call it. And I say, but Deputy Minister, what we are talking about is a kind of benevolent, strong government that stabilizes the country and intervenes to ensure that we deal with the scourge of corruption and all the rest of it, and bring about development in the country. And, you know, I don't want to now say there are examples on the continent, but because these are being used now to say this is what we need on the continent. The problem is, if you land up with a despotic autocrat, that's where we have come from historically in a number of countries, then we're all in very serious trouble. Worse still, if it is a kleptocratic autocrat, then you've got very serious problems in the country. So we must be very careful when we start to talk about these things. You know, what exactly are we talking about, and how do we appreciate some of these things? But key at the end must be the problem we are trying to resolve. And the problem that we are trying to resolve is the eradication, at least the alleviation to start with, of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So I think, you know, I've kind of tried to address that. Let me lastly turn to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not something that should be there to manage competition. It must be there to build complementary economies on the continent. A few years ago, in the late 1990s, President Obasanjo, being president at the time, was tasked by the African Union to bring a group together to talk about a single, well, the precursor to the African Union, to talk about one African government. And he invited a number of presidents, President Mbeki, President Wad, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, himself was there, and I forget who the others. They invited 5 think tanks, and we were lucky to have been invited. And then the foreign ministers of those countries were there, and they brought Professor Mamdani from Uganda to lead on the discussion. And part of that discussion came about, you know, revolved also around the how we can produce, based on comparative advantage, food products in different countries. And there was a long argument about standards and about whether countries would adhere to certain standards, hygiene standards, etc., etc., etc. And it showed the difficulty in building very rapidly what we are seeking to do with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because it will take a long time to cross through those tariffs and borders and all the rest of the technical details that need to be negotiated. A practical example of that, when we were working on the DRC conflict, supporting President Masira, many of you will remember the late President Masira was a farmer. And one day he was talking to us and he said, Vasu, your people are really bad in South Africa. And I said, President, what is the problem? He said, you know, we are growing green beans here in the farm, and we are trying to export to Woolworths, but they want all the green beans to be straight so they can fit in a packet and be straight. And, you know, we can't tell our green beans to grow straight because some are growing crooked also. And I said, yeah, President, unfortunately, President, this is the requirement. The customers want to see their green beans in the packet all looking straight. And, you know, now it takes a lot in technology and that to make all your green beans grow straight. But he was making a point. And the point I'm making, Chair, is that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement with all these crooked green beans is not going to be so easy to implement overnight. So there will be, a lot to deal with before we have one market on the continent, one currency on the continent. And let me end by then saying that, we can talk about the history, and we must correctly so reflect on our history, because we cannot take a historical view to our current situation. But as everybody understands also, our training for many of us has been understand the objective conditions you are dealing with now, and use the facts and the conditions you are dealing with now to look at how you are going to shape the future, bearing in mind where you come from historically. And right now, Chair, we have very, very serious challenges on the continent. I'm very glad that your committee has decided to focus on this. We are ready to assist you. I have, and I will reaffirm my invitation to your committee to come to Durban. We're very happy to host you here. And to continue this discussion, because you are not acting in your own personal interests. You are acting in all our interests as citizens of this country. And as I said, I'm very happy to see that, despite the political parties, understandably so, coming from different political persuasions, are putting their different cases on the table, that they all have a focus on our national interest and our continental interest. And we should find some harmonious way of ensuring, for example, Honorable Powell, when we are talking about mercenary groups on the continent, and you're wanting to put a resolution on that, let's be all-encompassing and all-inclusive, and let's include all those private contractors on the continent, not single one out or the other. And certainly you will have our support if you want to tabulate some of that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thanks, Doc. Thanks very much, Dr. Vasu. Honorable Powell, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to make a recommendation to you as the chairperson, and then just ask Dr. Gounden to clarify something.
No problem.
So we deeply appreciate your learned expertise, your many decades of experience on the ground, and your contributions and making time to come and speak to this committee and enlighten us. It's really appreciated. I think we should have more engagements like this with Accord. I just so the first question to Dr. Gounden is regarding the Ukrainian Special Forces. I was wondering if the doctor would provide some clarity in regards to the reasons as to why the Ukrainian Special Forces are in the Sahel. My understanding is that the Ukrainian Special Forces are operating in the Sahel region to destabilize Russian forces who are extracting minerals from mineral-rich regions in Africa that are being used to fund the illegal imperialist war of aggression that Russia is waging in Ukraine. So it's actually part of the Ukraine's defense strategy. And my understanding is that it was indeed the Ukrainian forces that leaked the location of the Wagner group in Mali last year to the rebel groups, and I think over 20 mercenaries, Russian mercenaries, were then killed. So that's just a bit of, if some clarity could be given as to exactly why my understanding is that that's a counter operation in defense of their own sovereign territory. Nevertheless, Chairperson, my recommendation to you is that it's our obligation as parliamentarians to provide, obviously we don't instruct the executive, we exercise oversight, but we can make recommendations. So my request of you is that a full committee meeting is scheduled, that we're able to deliberate a variety of recommendations that we as the Portfolio Committee for International Relations will then make to the executive in terms of what we believe as parliamentarians on this portfolio South Africa's action should be in regards to stabilizing the situation in that region in specific. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thanks, Honorable Powell. Dr. Vasu?
Yeah, Chair, thank you very much. Honorable Powell, you're correct that this is the motivation that the Ukrainians gave. And it's correct what they provided in the case of Mali, they provided the intelligence on that side. In the case of Sudan, they provided combat forces on the ground. And ostensibly, they might have said the same motivation in Sudan, that Wagner was involved for a long time and involved in extracting gold that went to Russia, and that is financing. Of course, Russia will argue that yes, it did stockpile gold from Sudan in order to counter sanctions that it anticipated were coming from the West. And so they use the gold to buffer against the sanctions. So, you know, the Russians will have their narrative, the Ukrainians will have their narrative. And what we are saying is, please take your narratives and fight your war on your own territory. Please don't come and fight on our territory. We do not need proxy wars in Africa. We have had proxy wars in Africa before, when the Soviet Union and the United States fought their proxy war on the continent. We have had colonial wars on the continent. We do not need any of that. We are in serious trouble right now. If we don't stabilize our continent in the next decade or 2 decades, this is my prediction. I've given this on many platforms where we will slide many countries, largely starting in those Sahel regions, into a dystopian future that will be very difficult to reverse. So we need to very quickly take our control of our sovereign territory, our security, all of those things. And, you know, for me, really, I don't. And my colleagues in the AU and everywhere else here in the country, they know my views on this. You know, we have a national interest, we have a continental interest. That's what must be front and center. Whoever we can work with in partnership that can help us to move forward. And I will say this, Chair, yes, we did set up IBAN for that purpose. We've also set up Africa Green Gold, working with key personalities on the continent, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam, the former Prime Minister of Sudan, who's a development economist, Hamdok, and many other personalities, Grasa Michel included, to look at agriculture, where we are saying, and we are talking to the colleagues in China, in the Gulf countries, etc., to say, look, you want these agricultural products, by all means, you should come and take those agricultural products, but keep the value chain from production to transport to processing to packaging to storing on our continent, so that we employ our people in that entire value chain. When it leaves the harbor, you are welcome to take it, provided you leave enough for our food security on the continent. Because we want you to take those goods that we put on your ships, because we want foreign exchange into our continent to help us, you know, to buy things that we don't have. We may not have, you know, other goods that we need to buy. So yes, we are talking to partners, and I was in Europe, you know, there at the Munich Security Forum when I addressed this question 2 years ago. And I met with a number of the European governments last year, and with the Americans, with the Chinese, etc., to say to them, Africa is asking for a new non-exploitative partnership, a true partnership that benefits both sides. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasu. Thanks very much, and for being patriotic, and you are a very important resource to Parliament through this portfolio committee. Thanks very much. I think we are coming. We will come to our court in KZN. We're just working on the logistics. It's gonna happen. And maybe with you one day, we may, through our court, work with you to go to this region, the Sahel region. You can suggest to us, we'll look at it on what should our approach be there and so on. And if we agree as a committee, then we will go with you. If you subsidize us going there, I'm sure Parliament will be happy. I'm sure you can get some good Samaritan somewhere. You can see from this afternoon, everything's going to be constrained financially here in the country. Yes. Everything's going to be highly constrained for the next 18 to 24 months because our economy is not doing very well. So we don't want the taxpayers to say we are driving, flying around, and they take too long, some of them, to comprehend why it's important for some of this work to be done, whilst, yes, we need to make sure that we are prudent in how we use the taxpayers' money. So I really want to thank you.
Let me say,
Yes.
Chair, that I think that will be a good idea for a multi-party committee from Parliament to go
Yes.
to some of these countries, because it also then allows all of you to harmonize your views. It's important for our country that you harmonize your views, because you can differ internally on issues, but at least on our national interest as it relates to our relationship with the rest of the world, you should at least have some agreement, And I see Deputy Minister Bottas, maybe you'll release some money from the African Renaissance Fund for that.
It's a tripartite alliance.
I second that proposal, Chair. Great idea.
Okay.
Advocate Vasu, you did such an excellent presentation, but
I thought I should ambush you here.
Okay, Dr. Vasu, thanks for that, honorable members.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And thank you all for your attention and time.
Yes, I think Honorable Mwela made a proposal on recommendations seconded by Honorable Powell. So that's the route we will take, Honorable Powell, in as far as recommendations are concerned. I really want to thank you, honorable members. This afternoon is Wafa, the budget for 2025-26. So I hope that we will all be paying attention to what the minister is going to be saying, and prepare ourselves as politicians to manage the situation beyond today, going forward until it's adopted somewhere in April. I don't know when. Many people think today the budget will be done and dusted. It's not like that. The minister is just going to do tabling, and from there it will be referred to the relevant committee. The committee will then take it down to the masses on the ground, depending on the feedback we get and the political boxing and behind the scenes management that will happen. It will then be adopted sometimes in April. Otherwise, I wish you good luck, honorable members, this afternoon. Let's meet in the Dome. Thank you very much.